Have you ever realized you were just the backup plan in your own family's future? The $180,000 housing fund set aside in my name. Gone. Not stolen by strangers, but quietly repurposed by the people who raised me. You're strong. You don't need it like she does, they said. I wasn't asking for more. I was asking for what was mine. So I gathered the records, the receipts, and the voicemail where my own parents said, "She always figures it out." They meant it as a compliment. It was actually a decision to erase me. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about reclaiming what they hoped I'd forget. If you've ever been told you're too independent to be supported, this is your reminder. Silence isn't peace. It's just permission for others to overwrite your future. Don't give it to them. Before we dive into the story, let me learn a bit about you. If you're a charming lady, please leave the number 1 in the comments. And if you're a dashing gentleman, leave the number 2. This way, I can send you a special greeting. Now, let's start the story together. It wasn't a conversation. It was a transaction. And I didn't realize I was just another line in the will. The rain had stopped by the time I pulled into my parents' driveway. The sky still hung low with clouds, the kind that don't move, just hover, like they're waiting for something. I walked up the path slowly, heels clicking against wet stone, clutching a half-wilted bouquet of lilies I'd picked up from the market. They were for Mom, though I didn't know why. We weren't the kind of family that said thank you. We just handed over things. Dinners, advice, criticism, wrapped in silence. The living room hadn't changed in 20 years. Same wood-paneled walls, same plush beige carpet that swallowed your footsteps. A dozen framed photos crowded the mantel. Vanessa at prom, Vanessa in her law school robe, Vanessa and Mark at the lake. I was in maybe 2. One from a summer picnic and one from the Christmas I'd accidentally overcooked the ham. Mom never let me forget that. We were all seated before the notary began. He was a kind-looking man with a thinning hairline and a voice like sandpaper rubbed on velvet. The will was straightforward. Dad had always been practical, and Mom didn't believe in dragging things out. To Vanessa Lynn Mercer, the notary read, heirloom jewelry belonging to the Bennett family, including the diamond necklace gifted to Margaret Bennett in 1963. Vanessa let out a small gasp, hand to chest, like it was a movie scene. I forced a smile. She looked good. Fresh blowout, perfect blush, a scarf I was sure was silk. Her fiancé Mark gave her a subtle squeeze on the knee. Then the notary turned a page. To Claire Elizabeth Bennett, a housing fund in the amount of $180,000 to be held in trust by Richard and Diane Bennett until such time as Claire shall require it for the purchase of her primary residence. No box, no envelope, no keepsake, just a line on paper. I nodded politely, cheeks flushed. It wasn't the money. It was what the money meant. Vanessa got history. I got responsibility. Vanessa got diamonds. I got instructions. Afterward, during dinner, the conversation hummed like it always did after funerals, soft and cautious with pauses too long to feel natural. I picked at the green beans, overcooked as always, while the antique clock on the wall ticked louder than the chatter. "You're so good with money anyway," Mom said, sliding a casserole dish toward me. "It just makes sense." I blinked. Just makes sense. As if logic had replaced love somewhere along the way. As if being careful, being stable, meant I didn't need care. Uncle Jake, sitting at the end of the table, didn't say much. He never did. But when I looked up, he was already watching me, one eyebrow raised. "Write everything down, Claire," he said quietly. "Every detail." I gave him a small nod. I didn't know why it mattered yet, but I trusted him. He was Dad's brother, but he'd always treated me like I wasn't invisible. Later that evening, I found myself alone in the kitchen. The wine bottle I brought was still unopened, shoved to the back of the counter like an afterthought. No one had offered me a glass. I didn't open it either. I just stood there, running my thumb along the edge of the cork like it might speak. That Thanksgiving the year before, Grandma had slipped an envelope into my coat pocket. No explanation, just a whisper. For your first home, when the time comes. I hadn't opened it for weeks. When I did, it was a check for $10,000 and a note that read, "To get you started. Love, Grandma." It was the only time anyone had said they believed in me with more than just words. Grandma never liked to talk much, but she always knew what to say without saying it. Now, sitting in the guest room with my coat draped over my lap, I stared out the window. Mark and Vanessa's laughter drifted from the living room, a high, polished sound that clashed with the weather. They were already talking about a wedding, a vineyard venue, something with string lights. I didn't resent them. I envied the simplicity of their certainty. I glanced down at my lap, at the edge of the envelope I kept in my wallet like a lifeline. Dad always said, "Money isn't love, Claire, but it's how we show it." That night, I understood what he meant. I also realized that showing love and giving it weren't always the same thing. The fund sounded generous, but it wasn't a gift. It was something held, something that could be withheld. And as I stared at the ceiling, listening to the antique clock tick through the dark, I remember thinking, at least they wouldn't take it away. I didn't know I'd be wrong about that, too. My bank app didn't break. My trust did. The floor fan hummed in its usual rhythm, sending a slow wave of lukewarm air across my apartment as I sat cross-legged on the beige carpet, laptop warming my knees. Outside, summer baked the Seattle sidewalks into cracked mosaics. Inside, I was busy building something invisible, dreams built out of tabs, Zillow listings, loan calculators, property tax estimators. This condo on 6th Avenue had just dropped in price by $20,000. It had light, real, uninterrupted morning light. I could almost see my bookshelf by the window. I reached for my journal and opened it to the taped note. Faded ink, slightly curled edges. Grandma's handwriting still had a waver to it. One day, this will help you build something that's yours. I pressed my thumb to the paper like it might transfer some of her steadiness. This was the day. I was ready. I had the down payment, the steady job, the list of lenders. All I needed was confirmation. I tapped out a message in the family group chat. "Hey, just wanted to double-check the status of the housing fund. I found a place I love. Can we talk this week?" 2 minutes later, Diane responded, "Don't stress, sweetie. Just focus on finding the right place. We'll talk when it's the one." It was evasive in that sugary way my mother mastered, the kind of reply that was meant to end a conversation with warmth, not clarity. Something pinched behind my eyes. I tried to brush it off as doubt or humidity. The next morning I called. Richard answered on speaker. I could tell by the way his voice echoed slightly, like I was on the counter beside a mug of coffee or a newspaper. "I just need to confirm the fund is ready," I said. "The seller wants a pre-approval and proof of funds by Monday." He cleared his throat. "Claire, you've always been good with money. You're stable. You don't need us the way Vanessa does." "I'm not asking for extra," I said carefully. "I'm asking for what was set aside." There was a pause. One of those awful stretching pauses that tells you the answer before the words arrive. "We used it," he said finally, "for Vanessa and Mark's house." The words didn't land all at once. They circled me like a draft I couldn't quite locate. Diane chimed in, lighter. "It was the right time for them, honey. The market was moving fast and you weren't looking then." "I wasn't looking because I was told to wait," I said, my voice low. "You said when the time came, it'd be there." "Oh, Claire," she sighed. "You always figure things out. That's who you are." I ended the call. Not abruptly, not angrily. Just ended it. I turned back to the laptop, the condo still open in one tab. The morning light I wanted. The hardwood floors. I didn't close the listing. I just sat there, staring. A text buzzed. Vanessa. "Hope we didn't mess up your plans too much. You'll land on your feet like always." I stared at the message long enough for the screen to dim. My thumb hovered. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened the Notes app and typed one line. They spent it. All of it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of what they did, but because of what it meant. The fan clicked as it rotated. From the neighbor's apartment came the faint, staccato cry of a baby. I'd heard it before, usually during late editing sessions or weekend mornings with my coffee. The soft, vulnerable sound reminded me of what I thought I'd have by now. A life built on some kind of foundation, not just plywood promises and unspoken IOUs. I sat in the dark with my knees pulled up to my chest, my arms wrapped around them, tighter than I realized. It was the posture of someone trying to make themselves smaller, safer. I didn't cry. Not then. It took 2 days before I opened the financial portal again, the same one my parents had used to show me the fund years ago, a shared dashboard. Passwords I still remembered. There was nothing. No Claire Whitmore account. No $180,000 balance. No transaction logs. Erased like it was never there. I messaged my mom again. Was there ever an account in my name? The reply was slower this time. Let's talk later, okay? Don't overthink this. I looked around my small apartment. The thrifted blue couch, the chipped mug on the window ledge. I wasn't ashamed of what I had. I'd built it on my own. But this wasn't about furniture. It was about being treated like I didn't matter. Like the only reason I got anything at all was because someone else didn't need it first. And when I finally asked them why they chose her over me, they said, "You're used to taking care of yourself." And for the first time, I realized that wasn't a compliment. It was a decision, and they'd made it long before they told me. They laughed when I said I was speaking to a lawyer. Not a sharp, cutting laugh, just a dismissive huff, like I'd confused them for people who took me seriously. I heard it over the speakerphone, sitting in my apartment with my vanilla-scented candle half melted on the coffee table, legal pads open like battle maps around me. That laugh made my decision for me. I used to think confrontation meant raised voices, slamming doors. But sometimes it sounds like silence on the other end of a call while your parents quietly diminish you. It had started with a memory, a foggy one at first. The envelope. I dug through my closet that night until I found it, still sealed, edges curled with time. Grandma's handwriting on the front had faded, but inside was the note I remembered. Ask only if they forget. I ran my thumb over the words, and that's when something clicked. They had forgotten, or maybe they'd hoped I would. By the next morning, I was no longer in mourning. I was in motion. I called Mr. Green during my lunch break, the same steady mentor who'd helped me navigate messy projects and toxic clients without ever raising his voice. He didn't flinch when I told him everything, just said, "I know someone. Quiet, efficient, very good." That someone was Laura Givens. We met at her office on a Thursday. The windows overlooked Pioneer Square, where rain fell in sheets. She wore flats and no-nonsense eyeliner. I liked her instantly. "Let's start with facts," she said, uncapping a pen. "No assumptions, just the paper trail." Over the next 2 hours, I told her everything. Dates, dollar amounts, even the tone of my mother's voice when she said, "Sweetie, you're so good with money anyway." Laura nodded but said nothing until I showed her the transaction screenshots. That's when her pen stopped moving. "They diverted it before your grandmother passed?" I nodded. "Then this wasn't miscommunication," she said. "It was premeditated." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just asked, "What do I do?" She looked at me like a doctor about to deliver a hard truth. "You stop asking. You start acting." That night, I called Uncle Jake. He picked up after 2 rings. "Claire?" "Hi," I said. "I need to talk." I told him everything. His voice was quiet at first, but I heard the shift when I mentioned the financial trail. He exhaled hard. "I knew something didn't sit right that day," he said, "and I should have said something sooner." "Will you help me?" "I already am." 2 days later, a letter of demand went out to my parents' address, drafted by Laura, signed electronically by me. Calm. Legal. No emotion. Just facts and consequences. While Laura arranged a forensic accountant, I arranged something else. Space. I cleared off my dining table, started sorting printed emails, notes, even screenshots of text messages. The apartment looked like a miniature war room. Each night I recorded myself, just one line per entry. Tomorrow I act. Tomorrow I ask no one's permission. Tomorrow I take back what's mine. It was therapeutic. It was terrifying. And it all came to a head when Laura's assistant forwarded me a preliminary report. The account had been quietly drained in small, regular withdrawals, starting 5 months before Grandma passed. Not just gone, but siphoned, strategically, like someone knew how to make it disappear without raising flags. It wasn't a slip, it was a scheme. Dear friend, what would you do if you were in my shoes? I bet you can't guess what's coming next. But before we go any further, drop a 5 in the comments if you're still with me, because what happens next might just leave you speechless. That night, I sat with Uncle Jake again, this time at a diner with greasy hash browns and lukewarm coffee. He was flipping through the report when he asked, "You know they live in a building under corporate ownership?" "Yeah," I said slowly. "Why?" He looked up. "What if you bought it?" I blinked. He didn't smile, just sipped his coffee. "What if you didn't just take back your future?" he said. "What if you changed the locks on theirs?" The hardest part wasn't the evidence. It was realizing how long they'd been preparing for me not to matter. Each file I opened, each bank document I downloaded, there was a timestamp. The dates lined up with family dinners, birthdays, holidays, moments when they smiled at me across a table while quietly deciding I didn't need to be part of their future. I started noticing patterns, how my mother always asked about work, but never about my apartment, how my father nodded at my promotion but never asked what it meant. They were invested in the version of me who didn't need anything, the self-sufficient daughter, the quiet one. But self-sufficiency doesn't mean I deserved silence. Laura once said, "Sometimes justice isn't loud, it's just patient." So I became patient. I tracked every conversation, every receipt. I called the credit union where the account used to be, confirmed there was never a joint listing in my name, just theirs. I stopped giving them the benefit of the doubt. On a rainy Sunday, I listened to one of my old voice memos. I had recorded it the day after the funeral. My voice was hoarse, tired. I'd said, maybe they just forgot. Maybe it was too much for them. I played it twice, and then I deleted it. Because forgetting is an accident. This was architecture, quiet betrayal, brick by brick. Late one night, I found the last birthday card my grandmother ever gave me. It had a watercolor house on the front and a folded check inside, uncashed. I had saved it, always planning to use it on the house. I ran my fingers along the creases and tucked it into the folder labeled evidence. I lit another vanilla candle and whispered aloud, "You didn't forget, Grandma." You knew I'd need proof. The next morning, I emailed Laura with subject line, "Next steps." We weren't just building a case anymore. We were dismantling a lie. They said I was overreacting until we played the recording. I remember watching their faces when the audio filled the small conference room. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. My mother's voice, soft, polished, sounded almost innocent when she said, "Claire's always managed on her own. She doesn't need that money the way Vanessa does." Then came my father's agreement, quiet but firm. "She'll figure it out. She always does." The room fell silent when the clip ended. No one spoke. I'd stopped waiting for apologies. That morning, I pulled my coat tight against the Seattle drizzle and walked into Laura's office with 3 things in my bag: the audio file, an email string Vanessa had carelessly CC'd me on last year, and a birthday card from my grandmother that still smelled faintly of lavender. Spring had come early to the city. Cherry blossoms bloomed along sidewalks, and people were trading wool coats for umbrellas. But in my apartment, spring hadn't arrived. It was all legal pads and forensic reports, coffee mugs with rings at the bottom, and a calendar filled with deadlines instead of dates to look forward to. Lara sat across from me, her laptop open, her expression unreadable. She hit play again. When my mother's voice came through a second time, slightly clipped, clearly rehearsed, Lara tapped her pen against the table. "That's not just callous," she said. "That's strategic. It'll help us prove intent." Uncle Jake leaned in. "You need more?" Lara smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, we're just getting started." The forensic accountant had finished his sweep. According to the report, withdrawals from the trust fund had begun 3 full months before Grandma's death. They'd started small, $200 here, $2,300 there. Then came a $30,000 withdrawal labeled interfamily transfer. It wasn't subtle, just undocumented. When I read that line, something in me crystallized. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an erasure. I opened the drawer next to my bed that night and pulled out my grandmother's note again. Her voice echoed in my memory, calm, unshakable. Trust doesn't need reminders, lies do. They had built their lives on the assumption that I would stay silent, and for a while I had. I told myself I was being mature, reasonable, understanding, but understanding doesn't mean accepting. Vanessa called once that week. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail. "Hey, I know things are weird right now, but Mom and Dad said you're getting serious about lawyers? Just don't do anything rash, okay? We can talk." She said talk like it was a synonym for convince. I forwarded the voicemail to Lara. She labeled it Exhibit B. Later that evening, a longer voicemail arrived, this time from my mother. "You're tearing us apart, sweetheart. This family has been through so much. We were only trying to help your sister get her feet under her. She needed it more than you. You're strong. You always have been. Please don't do this." I listened once, then again. There was a tremble at the end of her voice, but I didn't feel guilt, just distance. It's funny how people redefine help when it benefits them. Lara compiled everything: recordings, documents, the power of attorney abuse, the misrepresented will clause. According to her, we had more than enough to move forward, and we did. The preliminary hearing was scheduled. A freeze was placed on the remaining assets, limited but symbolic. It meant something was happening, that they couldn't continue like nothing had happened. I stood in front of my closet the night after we received the court notice and hesitated. Then I reached for the navy blazer I hadn't worn in years, structured shoulders, clean lines. I paired it with dark jeans, crisp flats. Not because I had anywhere to be, but because I was someone else now, someone who kept receipts, someone who no longer mistook silence for peace. When Uncle Jake saw me, he nodded slowly. "You look like her." "Who?" "Your grandmother. She didn't bluff either." That night, I cleaned my apartment. Not just tidying, real cleaning. I boxed up old birthday cards I used to keep out for comfort. I filed paperwork into labeled binders. The coffee table was finally clear. When I sat down, it felt like the first real exhale in months. Then my phone buzzed. One new text. "Vanessa, you really want to destroy this family over money?" I stared at it. There was no question mark, just a statement, a test. But here's the thing about tests. They reveal who's actually been paying attention. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened the audio app on my phone and recorded my nightly log. "Tomorrow," I said, "we speak in court." Justice doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it just feels cold. I stepped into the courthouse that morning with my heart doing a steady, stubborn thud against my ribs. The August sun was bright, but inside the building it was all polished tile, dusty light through tall windows, and the lingering scent of legal paper and old wood. My heels echoed with each step as if the building needed to announce my arrival. Lara walked beside me, briefcase in hand, calm as always. Uncle Jake held the door and offered a quiet nod, his eyes more tired than usual. I took a breath that didn't quite settle and followed them into the courtroom. The judge sat high behind the bench, his glasses low on his nose, flipping through our file with a kind of surgical precision. It wasn't a dramatic setting, not the kind of scene movies make a fuss over, but there was weight in the room, an unspoken tension that sat behind every cleared throat and rustled paper. Claire Bennett versus Richard and Diane Bennett. They didn't look at me when I entered. My parents sat stiffly beside their attorney, Diane clutching a tissue in one hand, her other gripping the edge of the bench. Richard looked down at the table, jaw tight. Vanessa wasn't there. I noticed that more than I expected to. The presentation was methodical. Dates, documents, withdrawals, and testimony. The forensic accountant took the stand first, mapping out the timeline in steady, unimpeachable terms. He pointed out transactions that had no legal standing and described how the trust had been accessed under false pretenses. A former caregiver of my grandmother, brought in quietly, testified that she overheard my parents discussing early access to funds while my grandmother was still in hospice. When the audio was played, the one with their voices casually planning around me, I looked at the judge instead of them. His expression didn't change much, but his pen stopped moving. That told me everything I needed to know. Richard tried to speak up, claiming confusion, saying he misunderstood the rules of the trust. "It was for the family," he said. "We thought it was flexible. Claire's never needed hand-holding. She's strong." Diane broke first. She whispered something to their lawyer, then leaned into her mic, her voice cracking. "We didn't think it would get this far. We were just trying to help Vanessa. Claire. She's always been the steady one. We didn't think she'd turn on us." Turn. That word stuck with me, like I'd betrayed them by defending myself. The judge let the silence settle before delivering his ruling. Judgment in favor of Claire Bennett. Full repayment of the $180,000, plus damages and legal costs. There was no applause, no gasps, just the scratching of a pen and the sound of a life dividing clean down the middle. When we stepped outside, the sunlight felt foreign. Lara gave me a gentle pat on the shoulder. "This part is over." But I know it's not the part that hurts the most. I nodded. She was right. Later that week, I signed the papers with the real estate agent. The building on 48th Street, where my parents had lived for the past 6 years, was under corporate ownership, recently listed for sale. They had no idea I was the buyer. Uncle Jake had helped set it up through a holding company, and once the court ruling was in hand, I used a portion of the damages to finalize the deal. It was legal. It was clean. It was quiet. When I stood at the signing table, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt tired. But I also felt something like certainty, like the ground was finally stable beneath my feet. I went home that night and opened the old family photo albums. There was one picture I hadn't looked at in years, Vanessa's wedding. My parents stood tall, smiling. Vanessa glowed in white. And there I was, half visible at the edge of the frame, cropped by a floral arrangement, eyes barely in focus. Even in our memories, I was on the outskirts. A week later, the first rent invoice was sent. Payer, Diane Bennett. Property manager, Claire Bennett. I didn't expect them to acknowledge it. I didn't need them to. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine, not to celebrate, but to mark something, a boundary, a line drawn in ink, finally honored in practice. There were no congratulations, no triumphant playlist in the background, just the soft hum of my apartment's AC and the silence of a story that had finally turned its last page. For a moment, I held the envelope from Grandma again. I'd kept it sealed all these years. This time, I opened it. Inside was a second note. If they make you fight for what's yours, take it. But remember, peace isn't the absence of pain, it's the presence of self. They thought I'd throw them out, but I didn't have to. Rent day does that on its own. It was early spring in Seattle, and the cherry blossoms along 48th Street were just starting to open. I'd gotten used to the view from the top. My penthouse wasn't flashy, but it was mine. All clean lines, wide windows, and quiet mornings. A place where the silence didn't carry weight. It just lived with me. Downstairs, life moved on as usual. Tenants came and went, deliveries were made. The building staff rotated in and out with their familiar greetings and rustling keys. I'd made a point not to micromanage. I'd set the management system on autopilot, payments logged, notices emailed, no personal touches, no direct messages, not even for them. They lived 2 floors down now. Apartment 5C, I hadn't seen inside since they moved back in under the new lease. It wasn't my business anymore. That was the entire point. A few weeks ago, my mother had tried to accidentally bump into me in the elevator. I'd nodded, said hello, and let the doors close behind me. No anger, no bitterness, just space. Mr. Green called that afternoon. His tone was warm but direct, like always. "Claire, the team's expanding. We've got room for someone with your head and your history. You interested in learning the ropes of property acquisition?" I paused, glancing at the lavender candle burning on the shelf beside my desk. "Maybe," I said. "Let me finish something first." Later that day, the mail arrived. There it was, an envelope addressed in my mother's handwriting. Inside, a cashier's check for the full rent amount, made out to my company, signed, dated, compliant. I scanned it, uploaded it to the tenant record, and filed it away. Then I lit another candle and sat with the quiet. A neighbor mentioned in passing that my mother looked tired lately, that she'd been quiet in the laundry room, folding towels like they were breaking news. I smiled gently, not out of cruelty, but recognition. "She used to say the same about me," I replied. I hadn't sent an eviction notice, I hadn't raised the rent, I hadn't knocked on their door. But there are other kinds of consequences. The days had a rhythm now, slower, steadier. I started brewing my coffee later in the morning, savoring the quiet instead of fighting it. The rooftop garden I once ignored had become my small sanctuary. I planted rosemary and mint last week, not because I needed them, but because they reminded me of dinners I used to dream of hosting. Sometimes I imagined younger versions of myself wandering through this space, barefoot, skeptical, eyes wide. She'd ask, "Did we really make it here?" And I'd nod. We did. Not because they gave it to me, but because they didn't. I still saw them in the building sometimes, my father in the mailroom, sorting envelopes like he was still in charge, my mother by the recycling bins, her posture a little less sure than it used to be, but we didn't talk. We didn't need to. The silence wasn't cold anymore. It was clean. At night, I recorded notes on my phone. Not for legal reasons, not anymore. Just small truths. Today I paid my own taxes. Today I rewired the light in the entryway. Today I chose peace, even when pride wanted a word. I don't know if they'll ever say sorry, and maybe it doesn't matter. Some debts aren't meant to be paid in words. They're meant to be outgrown, and I have. I truly have. There's something sacred about claiming your space without shouting. No gloating, no dramatic scenes. Just structure. Ownership. The quiet power of knowing you don't owe anyone an explanation. The building doesn't ask if I'm angry. The walls don't care who said what first. They just hold the life I built, on paper, in person, and most importantly, in peace. I walked over to the bookshelf and pulled out the box of keepsakes I kept tucked behind some old cookbooks and forgotten novels. Inside was the last letter from Grandma, the one I'd read a dozen times but never fully absorbed. This time I opened it slowly, hands steady. "Claire, build your own house," it read, "even if it's just in your name." It wasn't just a metaphor, it was a blueprint, a boundary, a blessing. I stood by the window as the light shifted over the skyline, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a daughter, I felt like my own person, unapologetically. Has someone ever turned your future into their backup plan? Tell me your moment of reclaiming it. I'm listening. The envelope was small, but the meaning behind it was enormous. I used to think justice would feel like a loud victory, but sometimes it feels more like choosing silence over shouting. What I've learned is this: family isn't just about blood. It's about respect, about showing up with honesty, even when it's hard. And when trust is broken, rebuilding doesn't always mean reconciliation. It can mean rebuilding yourself, stronger and clearer than before. If this story reminds you of a time you had to reclaim your peace, I'd love to hear it. Your voice matters, especially when it's finally your turn to speak. If this story touched your heart, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more stories about resilience and hope. Thanks for watching.